And with that, I think I would like to introduce our first keynote speaker, Kavita Phillip. Kavita Phillip is an associate professor of history and affiliate faculty of informatics at our sister campus, the University of California, Irvine. She works in environmental studies, colonial history, post-colonial studies, history of technology, political economy, and science fiction studies, which is quite a portfolio. She's the author of Civilizing Natures on interdisciplinary work in radical history, political science, art activism, gender, and public policy. Her presentation today will be on A Dose of Rum and a Few Rupees, revisiting the romance of the commons. Please join me in welcoming Professor Phillip.
Thanks, Mackenzie. I'm really excited to be here. Although this is my first physical trip to Davis, I've actually been working with the ideas of many in your group. For instance, Mario's work was absolutely central to my training in graduate school. Both the STS reader and the work on scientific authorship. Librarians are my favorite people to work with because you understand not only the history of the book, but the future of how we order data about information. And I'm here literally because of Alexandra and Michael, both of whom worked very hard to educate me about the really unusual interdisciplinary group that you have here. So thank you all for making this possible. It will be clear in my title, if I go back to the title, the subtitle is already inspired directly by the 2004 piece that you cited. So for those who are in the group, that will be familiar, and for others, I will make that connection clear, I hope, in a minute. My talk is a little bit long, so thanks for starting us off early because I really want to have time for questions and discussion. I'm also going to talk mostly about environmental work, which I did early in my career, and I've been working more on the technological, the sort of computational turn since then. But I'm going to try to turn back and revisit some of those, and you'll see why. In a 2012 article in the International Journal of Technological Learning, Innovation, here's your other keyword, and Development, Indigenous Knowledge Crusader and Indian Institute of Management Professor Anil Gupta extolled a bottom-up model of property rights that has become familiar to many who followed the last 3 decades of activism and policy contests over IPR. I've written about Gupta's alternative IPR model, which was inspired early on by open source software and explicitly the politics of GNU and GPL. So I've written twice before, in 2001 and in 2008, so I'm going to review some of that. Apologies to those who were reading me at that point. But what I'm going to talk about is some of what I observed during the 1990s, a decade of vigorous anti-globalization activism in India. But more broadly, I wish to think with you today about the promise of Indian traditional knowledge databases alongside the rise of 3 important critiques of sink-to-source value transfers. So in the previous slide, you saw 2 quotes on sinks that I want to go back to. So the first thing I want to engage with then is work in environmental geography that casts a critical eye on the celebration of metabolic models of revitalized value chains emerging from wastes and sinks. Secondly, I want to think explicitly about Anupam Chandar and Madhavi Sundar's assessment of the legal purchase of common knowledge, particularly in their 2004 article, The Romance of the Public Domain, in which they commented, quote, "From the corporate point of view, the timing of this romance for common good is perfect," end quote. That question of timing will take me to the timeline of histories of development. That's the third set of discourses with which I want to engage specifically today. And the third, then, is the work in economic histories of development after colonialism, primarily the work of Kalyan Sanyal, a Bengali economist, which was most famously taken up by Partho Chatterjee and is known for some of the political insights Chatterjee gets from it. But I want to go back to the work of Sanyal, which retains many underappreciated economic insights for analyses of what I call the new global South. In that term, referring quite explicitly as a metaphor to the New South. I spent a lot of time in Atlanta, which is talked about as the sort of vanguard of the New South, and the metaphorical resonance is deliberate. But let me get to my first point very quickly. Environmental geographer Lindsay Dillon, who also spent time here as a postdoc, observes the rise of what she calls the attractive, entrepreneurial, and alchemic notion that something so ubiquitous as trash could become a source of profit. When she asked a few years ago, will trash become the 21st century's post-natural resource? This metaphor that Dillon used, of course, of base metal being transformed into gold, traced in the revaluation of waste to profits, sinks to productivity, and poverty to opportunity, will be a thread through my talk. Dillon was citing Jennifer Gabrice, and she commented, quoting Gabrice, quote, "Metabolism is as much socio-political as biophysical. The problem," continuing the quote, "with vitalist and naturalizing metaphors of source to sink cycles is to suggest that some natural equilibrium is the ideal to which then we need to return in policy." Art science scholar Jennifer Gabrice, arguing against metabolic imbalance and natural purity, shows how the notion of sinks as the dirt outside the system is both ecological and political. Quote, from Gabrice, sinks operate as a tool for negotiating ecological balance, but also as an instrument of political management. Gabrice advocates parasitism against balance, dissensus against consensus. Here she was drawing too on yet another UC colleague of ours, Donna Haraway, quote, "When the carbon dioxide production of industrial cultures is absorbed by plant materials, the plants themselves become service providers to the industrial economy." This is Haraway. And Haraway is at pains to note, of course, that, quote, "such a mode of thinking is more than just metaphorical," end quote. So the move from the metaphor of sinks to waste to service production will also reappear as I continue my argument. Dillon's treatment of waste brings the new technologies of recycling and revaluing, as well as global economics and geographies of labor and productivity, into the same analytical frame. So we'll come back then to waste, sinks, and service labor. Let me go on to Anupam Chandar and Madhvi Sundar. It is a strange world indeed, they say, in the same 2004 piece, where technology and resources flow for free from poorer to richer states rather than from richer to poorer. While it is certainly not their intent, scholars' romantic portrayals, that's us, of the public domain perpetuate this inequality, they say. Chandar and Sundar in this piece reviewed, among other responses to the globalization of IPR in the 1990s, the Indian government's TKDL, the Traditional Knowledge Digital Library. It is, quote, "perhaps the most self-conscious of the efforts to make traditional knowledge inalienable from the public domain," they said. They commented at the time on two dangers. One, the database, if publicly available, is free for proprietary actors to use. And two, patent claimants can still claim inventive leap over prior art and build on knowledge in the public domain. Chandar and Sundar noted that the TKD, the Traditional Knowledge Database approach, quote, "establishes the ingenuity of traditional communities, but by preventing monopoly rights in certain information, the TKD might reduce the economic value of that information, leaving diminished profits to share with local communities," end quote. In a creative call then to invent new notions of what they called a limited commons, rejecting binaries of complete privatization versus completely free commons, Chandar and Sundar nevertheless acknowledged that the, quote, "unequal tilt in the public domain's exploitation follows naturally from the dynamics of production and commerce in a world characterized by deep inequality. There are frequent references to histories of inequality and the need to rethink theoretical and normative foundations of intellectual property law have helped me return to the study of the Third World and its history with a renewed belief that this history matters in the search for more egalitarian systems of sharing. Allow me then to return to work I was doing in the 1990s. And you'll hear some repetition for those already familiar with this history. The Uruguay round of the General Agreement on Trades and Tariffs, or GATT, concluded in December 1993. It finalized the Dunkel draft, to which India was a signatory. The country erupted in protests. One of the most significant aspects of the draft that was articulated in those protests was the controversial issue of intellectual property rights as they applied to plant products. The conflict between local users and international pharmaceuticals manifested itself right away in the form of demonstrations by left party formations and grassroots NGOs against the Indian government's signing of the Dunkel draft. Organizations for the protection of indigenous knowledge argued that the new economic order privileged multinational pharmaceutical corporations. They argued that in issuing corporate patents on herbs and medicinal plants that had been traditionally used by many groups, international law was failing to recognize the contribution of indigenous people to the preservation of valuable biological products over several centuries, and further that such patents threatened the free uses of plants by local communities. Feminist groups argued that rural women's knowledge of ritual plants and healing practices would be eroded by the encroaching forces of modernity. Multinational corporations, on the other hand, contended that the chemical and genetic engineering processes that these resources passed through in their laboratories established the final product clearly within the province and ownership of modern techno-scientific enterprise. So we know the rough outlines of that debate. In fact, of course, almost any local progress is contradictory when the systemic questions are always global, and the stakes here were very high. Gains for biodiversity could mean increased influence for Western pharmaceuticals in southern nations, but also increased funding for southern environmental NGOs, and we saw this growth go through the roof. So, for instance, while the international biodiversity preservation lobbies generously funded local southern NGOs, they often also opened up channels for pharmaceutical corporations to access local knowledge of medicinal uses of plants. The popular circulation of a global discourse of environmentalism then glossed over many political differences. On the face of it, the patent debate appeared in the 1990s to be a straightforward case of conflict between Western industrialized nations propelled by a multinational pharmaceutical lobby seeking to monopolize ownership of natural resources, on the one hand, and developing nations seeking an equitable share in the trade of their own natural wealth, on the other. The official state discourses were quickly challenged and modified by the NGO presence right from the Rio Earth Summit onwards. Southern NGOs raised the question of indigenous populations' rights to nature and their conflicted relationship with their own states. So opening up this myth of the kind of uniform voice of a nation. The UN Working Group on Indigenous Populations, several other large and small nonprofit and non-governmental organizations in the 1990s demanded an international voice for indigenous peoples groups, and in succeeding, created a new category of international actor in the debate over intellectual property rights to nature. Those who would speak for the indigenous, the poor, and the marginalized would, in the next decade, get to rewrite the terms of global exchange. In that 2001 paper, I surveyed a range of Indian activist and scholarly responses to this globalization of the politics of science, technology, and the economy. Those included the neo-traditionalists. That's not a term I coined. It was used in a classic paper by Sinha, Greenberg, and Gururani in the Journal of Peasant Studies. The eco-feminists, whom we know well, and the pro-science Enlightenment leftists. One great example from STS was Meera Nanda, who came out of the upstate New York STS configurations that I was also part of in the 90s. In response to various kinds of traditionalist environmentalism, a debate emerged drawing participants from social movements, intellectual classes, and nationalist capitalism. The central question was about the global South's ability to appropriate the global North's tools. Some grassroots groups took the possibility of ownership to be a potentially empowering one and suggested that modernity might be co-opted rather than resisted head-on. I called this the pragmatist environmentalist position in the sense that the actors adopted a pragmatic rather than a critical ideological position with respect to Western capitalism and modernity. Now, those of you who know the Indian scene know that this was unusual in the 1990s. It was more popular to be critical ideological, but 20 years later, pragmatism has often turned out to be the winning proposition in the new global South. In particular, one activist intellectual coalition at the time, the Shrishti Honeybee Network, took the view that the legal means of privatization could be used to challenge the authority of multinationals to operate within the spaces of traditionally defined uses of medicinal plants. So Anil Gupta, Shrishti coordinator, argued that environmentalists who asserted the incompatibility of indigenous practices with private property were deepening the exploitation of grassroots innovators, his term, rather than protecting their freedom from modernity. So in an important way, Gupta was sort of anticipating the Chandar Sundar critique, I think. This inversion of the narrative of indigenous economies as inherently free was an early complication in the altruism versus private property story that was being set out for Western intellectual property audiences. Shrishti claimed to be developing the world's largest database on grassroots innovations. Each entry included names and addresses of innovators, individuals or communities. Topics included herbal pesticides, fertilizers, veterinary medicine, farm implements, soil and water conservation, and common property management. And I joined Anil Gupta's group on an early walk, which was called the Shodh Yatra, the journey to search. Shrishti set up a registration system that I watched as it was developed for grassroots innovation that seeks to link investment, private and public, enterprise, and innovation. So Honeybee is a magazine of and for local innovators, as it described itself, published in 8 Indian languages. Although the neo-traditionalists and the pragmatists rarely addressed each other in print, I found it instructive to contrast their diametrically opposed positions on preservation of the environment and local knowledge of it. Traditionalist communitarians, and I'll mention one commonly cited example in the 1990s, Madhav Gadgil and Ramchandra Guha, for example, read the practice of modernity as the thinly veiled text of neocolonialism and argued that we must refuse this subjugation by rediscovering our egalitarian, eco-friendly roots in ancient models of the village community. Anil Gupta, on the other hand, a pragmatist environmentalist, agreed that indigenous knowledge is under threat, but argued that precisely because of the historical fact of colonial and post-colonial globalization, we could not afford to contemplate the fantasy of reconstructing isolated, self-sufficient local communities. What Gadgil and Guha seemed to leave unarticulated was the material basis of the alternate ethics to which they called for a return. Dividing Indian society into the environmentally friendly ecosystem people and the rapacious, modernizing omnivores, they advocated a Gandhian conservation ethic. Insofar, they said, as Gandhism seeks to conserve all that is best in our traditions, it might be called the Indian variant of conservatism. It seeks to preserve not hierarchy, they said, but repositories of wisdom in ecosystem people. Gadgil and Guha argued further that power to use natural resources, power to use natural resources should lie not with insensitive and corrupt bureaucracies, but with the people who most deeply depend on these resources. Today, those in power, the omnivores of India, can successfully pass on the costs of resource abuse and environmental degradation to the masses of ecosystem people and to ecological refugees. But the self-interest of India's, sorry for the typo, ecosystem people is congruent for the most part with the good husbanding of natural resources, at least in their own localities. The real solution, they said, for the long-term health lies in passing effective political power to the people. The question of which people were to have what sort of political power, how we might identify the most deep dependence on natural resources in a sort of race to the origin, or of how vested repositories of wisdom are to be preserved and evaluated were not addressed anywhere in Gadgil and Guha's otherwise prolific output. Anil Gupta at the time did not have the theoretical paradigm-shaping reputation of Guha and Gadgil. That's because his publications were mostly reports of the activity of the grassroots networks he forged and policy recommendations that he thought should follow from those experiences. His model was both aggressively local in that his examples were drawn from networks of Gujarati agriculturists who contributed to the honeybee archive of local practice, and unapologetically global in that he argued for a global market-based engagement with the economics of globalization at the time. So on the biodiversity-rich, economically poor communities who are viewed in the neo-traditionalist discourses as local ecologists whose anti-market model must be emulated for national survival, on that, Gupta argued, while these intentions are noble, this model seeks to tap knowledge without sufficient reciprocity. So he was taking on the traditionalist position directly by saying, you guys are trying to keep people poor. So granting then that local values often favored free and open knowledge sharing, he argued, nevertheless, that it was the activist's task to work at somewhat of a tangent to that tendency. He said, clearly, we cannot conserve diversity by keeping people poor. He says indigenous innovators, true, do not consider their diversity or knowledge a tradable commodity, and so they remain poor, while extractors of their knowledge accumulate wealth. He says, we cannot therefore imply that their ethics of sharing should legitimize a morality in the marketplace which justifies the extraction. The way out of this situation, Gupta argued, was not through a refusal to engage with the global market, but through an assertion of the right to value addition. Colonial systems of extraction had depended for their profits on extracting raw materials cheap from colonies so that the processes of manufacture, production, and marketing could occur in the metropole, thus keeping the value additive and profit-making elements under metropolitan control. Gupta believed that access to Western consumer markets for these local populations would provide them with incentives to continue to maintain or foster biodiversity. His assumption here is that local communities are not inherently necessarily conservationist, but that they have the potential to be so. Education in his model then must include global networks of institutions, individuals, and social movements, access for grassroots activists to scientific laboratories, a fund for rewarding creativity and innovation of the grassroots, this is all from his material, and institutionalized commitments to sustainability, human rights, gender equality, and ethical business. This model that he put forward was very different from the traditionalist vision of dispersed, self-sufficient communities who preserved their own knowledge by striving to protect it from global circuits of knowledge and commerce. These differences between the traditionalist and pragmatic visions were instructive and seemed to stem from each group's understanding of the power relations, injustices, and productive possibilities that made up the status quo in India. Remember, this was before the really big boom in Indian technology in a global way. We knew about that on the ground. But I think global commentators didn't quite see how the two would converge. Now, both these groups were accurately identifying constitutive injustices that led to the predicament of indigenous communities. It's true that colonialism and the capitalist global marketplace did wreak havoc on resource use, as the traditionalists argued. The existence of local hierarchies and unethical business practices in the contemporary moment did in fact deny the indigenous innovator entry into a market which was growing rich on his knowledge, as the pragmatists argued. However, If traditionalists allowed the nostalgia for a rosy past free of ecological, patriarchal, and Brahminical violence to substitute for the more painstaking task of writing detailed histories that acknowledge the contradiction in indigenous societies, the pragmatists, on the other hand, appear to have a rather benign vision of contemporary global markets. Although impressive in its elaborate infrastructure, its combination of field study and economic practice, and its unwavering concern to give local interests the highest priority, the pragmatist IPR model seemed to assume that free markets are really free, that small entrepreneurs can alter the functioning of international financial institutions and northern governments. In the pragmatist's world, there would be no forced structural adjustment policies, no manipulation of national policies by multinationals, no corporate subsidies and big business lobbies, no payoffs of indigenous groups in exchange for pharmaceutical corporate rights to their resources, and no hostile takeovers of small producers by global monopolists. And in the light of Peter Thiel's comment that competition is for losers and monopoly is the real way forward, I think that caution comes back to haunt us. The traditionalist and the pragmatist model are both important components of oppressed people's dreams of liberation, and I don't mean to dismiss them in the critique that will follow. Yet their misreadings of global and local power skewed their predictive efficacy. Further, both of these schools of environmentalism were largely silent on the issue of nationalism. Several aspects of this debate hinted early on at the ideological questions that lie at the heart of globalization and nationalism. Implicit on the multinational insistence on tying together property rights, free market, and progress were, as many scholars claimed, Lockean assumptions about the ownership and improvement of property. Implicit in Southern states' opposition to patent claims on their natural resources were claims about historical accountability and the right to demand reparations for past injustices. For example, the very popularly cited at the time US patenting of modified strains of basmati rice, so Texmati and Kasmati, was undergirded by the assumption that private capital can be spurred to continual innovation only if it is awarded the rights of exclusive ownership and profits from the physical and intellectual labor expended on its products. The Indian contestation of this and similar patents was based most simply on the claim that modified strains were neither novel nor non-obvious. Further, until the early 2000s, the Indian Patent Act specifically excluded agricultural and pharmaceutical inventions from patentability. The new IPR regimes, of course, put into place after the WTO agreements fundamentally changed some of this. But more profoundly, the Southern argument rested on a premise of historical accountability. This deeper premise suggests that the West had access to raw material, indigenous basmati strains developed by Indian farmers, for example, only by virtue of the force of arms and the power of a colonial state that postulated inherent native laziness and indigenous incapacity to productively improve nature. Embedded in this debate, then, were historic questions about power and ideology, questions that the law at the time was ill-equipped to handle. Hence the frequent eruptions of this debate on the street. Much of that historical argument was thought to reside in the catchphrase that you would hear on the street, neocolonialism, that often accompanied Southern accounts of the patent debate. Unpacking the historical claims, however, brings us back to the re-examination of complex concerns today about neocolonialism and its new modes of resurgence, including its relationship to resurgent nationalism in the global South, as well as, of course, in Europe and North America, its reliance on the interdependence of Northern and Southern capitalism, its opportunistic perpetuation of existing semi-feudal hierarchies of gender and caste, and the rise of the new global South as tigers, dragons, and other kinds of new economic and technological market participants. So that catch-all phrase neocolonialism seems to miss some of those nuances. Its exclusive emphasis on North-South relations risks obscuring the stratifications and competing interests within Southern societies themselves. In the 1990s, another important political shift was occurring. although it was rarely noted in environmentalist analyses. The direction and policies of the Indian state were increasingly directed by the ideology of Hindu nationalism. So first it was part of a coalition government in the mid-90s, and then took state power from 1999. That emerging form of nationalism valued authenticity and tradition over modernity and the West, while simultaneously distancing itself through an American-style anti-communism from the non-aligned and socialist-inspired policies which had previously characterized post-independence Indian policy. In this rhetoric, again, in a contradictory way, multinational capital was often portrayed as the agent of neocolonialism. So Anil Gupta's Honeybee and the Indian government's TKDL, which I had preferred as it emerged in the 1990s, to the traditionalists and the eco-feminists. That was a longer debate, which is in my 2001 piece. I think my relatively optimistic view of Gupta at the time now looks differently situated in the new global South. Gupta's invocation of Gandhian modes of protest contrasts significantly with leftist mobilizations around labor issues. His invocation of a grassroots to global reordering privileges individual entrepreneurship and innovation over state-sponsored legal or political agendas, valuing a direct, authentic voice of the people over older party languages of left and right. Gupta, it's true, suggests a rebalancing of a system out of order. But his timing and his policy mechanisms today just seem to mirror a new turn to the poor as bearing the key to salvation for the future of capitalism. So I'm going to talk a little bit in the time I have left about the bottom of the pyramid, the promise of the poor, and the turn to the poor as in a salvation narrative. Again, to back up a bit, this is a long story. Historians of the British Empire have commented extensively on the ways in which discourses of property and subjectivity played themselves out in 19th century India. For example, Sudipto Sen summarizes a common historical claim about civil society and property. He said early colonial commentators on British Indian political economy believed what would be put forward unabashedly by James Mill in the early 19th century, namely that Indians as subjects were passive instruments and not full and conscious participants in their own polity. Their lack of liberty and perhaps also their loss of autonomy in conquest had reduced the Indians in this model to a state of perpetual unfreedom. Every freeborn Englishman, in contrast, had liberty and the right to property as his birthright. Indians were hardly capable, in this narrative, of apprehending the sanctity and institution of true property. The absence of these cardinal virtues, liberty and property put together, was indicative of an uncivil society in India, making indigenous rule illegitimate. It is precisely what seemed to have been denied for 200 years, the possibility of an indigenous civil society, the possibility of indigenous rational subjectivities that appears now to be marginally granted almost overnight with the dawning of a new computational technological order in the early 21st century. So I've argued elsewhere that we're witnessing a second permanent settlement with the emergence of a reconstituted elite class with its correspondingly regularized citizen subject. What I mean is that the conjunction of issues that have come together at the turn of this century, tying the new informatics and biopolitics to a decolonizing geography, are as profound an intersection as the 18th century permanent settlement, which established colonial land tenure systems in Bengal. Amartya Sen notes in his foreword to Guha's classic book on the subject that the permanent settlement in effect produced the new Indian elites who were to take center stage in the next century of Indian nationalism, reminding us, quote, that a rule of property for Bengal, that's the well-known book by Guha, has come from Ranajit Guha's attempt to understand better the roots of his own class and the ideas that led to its emergence, end quote. So this foundational book of subaltern studies that was hailed in the West as the voice of the voiceless, Amartya Sen sees as essentially the roots of a class that emerges to be elite in the next century. Partha Chatterjee sees the shift that I talk about as moving India out of the ranks of the third world. He says the old idea of the third world sharing a common history of colonial oppression and backwardness is no longer as persuasive as it was in the 1960s. The trajectory of economic growth, he says, in Asia has diverged from Africa. You've got India and China, setting into motion a process of social change that is unprecedented. Now, how do we understand the shift that Chatterjee is describing? Part of this is what I've called in other writing the myth of technology causing India to rise above the constraints of its third world history. That view, I think, is facilitated by the romance of technology minus political economy. But I'm going to find more satisfying than technology. In half a sentence, Chatterjee does say that technology is what's to credit for this, but he doesn't extend it. He's not a historian of technology. So I'm actually going to look at this shift, but I'm going to find much more satisfying than this political history, what most consider a drier and duller history, the history of economic development and the history of the informal sector. So let's go back. Oops, I'm going to give you this. 1998 and reissued in 2002, the now famous paper, The Fortune at the Bottom of the Pyramid. Business strategist C.K. Prahalad wrote, collectively, we have only just begun to scratch the surface of what is the biggest potential market opportunity in the history of commerce, the fortune at the bottom of the pyramid, which he says represents the loftiest of our global goals. Anthropologist Julia Eliachar has observed the historical shift of which this was a marker. After World War II and through the development era of the 70s and 80s, the poor in the former colonial world were objects of economic intervention. In order to be made proper consumers, states needed to care and feed the most destitute among them. Read the reports of poverty alleviation of any newly independent nation in the middle of the 20th century. The states were then to educate, uplift, and improve the poverty-stricken masses so that they could become full-blown wage earners, consumers, and citizens. By the end of the 1990s, the poor had been transformed from potential consumers to potential producers, from a drain on developing economies to the promise of regeneration for capitalists everywhere. State intervention now worked along with corporate initiatives and grassroots organizations. Eliachar sums up the transformation of the figure of the third world poor. They were not a group, she says, of disadvantaged citizens of former colonies in need of aid. They were a potential source of innovation and profits, end quote. So there was a string of stories that reached us through the turn of the century, whether it was Hernando de Soto and his scheme for property relations in Latin America, the Grameen Bank and micro-lending in South Asia, mobile banking in Kenya. Many, many of these stories were symptoms of this emerging bottom billion. Eliachar, whose background includes political economy and anthropological fieldwork in Cairo, was articulating, I think independently, the thesis propounded by Bengali political economist Kalyan Sanyal. He ordered in a 2007 book based on decades of empirical work that he had done in the agrarian economy of India's post-colonial landscape. He documented the emergence of the informal sector as an object of study in the 1970s. He showed how this informal sector was discursively produced as an object of study by development economists and anthropologists in the 80s. They followed Keith Hart's classic study of Kenya, for those who remember that. So Sanyal observed, quote, reports and studies began to constantly reproduce the informal sector, recreating and renewing its identity. So I'm going to summarize his historical account as best as I can. His prose is quite dense, and there'll be many tangents, but broadly through the 70s and 80s, he says, the prevalent image of the informal sector was one of a last resort for those who failed. And here's the narrative of failure throughout the development decades that we see in discourses of development. So these were the poorest of the poor. We had failed to make them wage earners, and fully blown citizens. This was what he called the miserablest approach. And certainly for those of you who studied development economics at the time, it was absolute unremitting misery. And he said this fit. You basically had to just redistribute income to address the misery at the bottom. But this negative vision, he says, shifts in the 1990s. Instead of describing it in terms of deficiency and lack, you found this informal sector as being painted as a space with inherent ingenuity and ingeniousness. So political economist Kalyan Sanyal is articulating a longer historical analysis of the Indian economy as part of a pattern of post-colonial development in which the rapidity and scale of advance in a small segment of population, the much touted Indian middle classes, which are in fact a sort of sliver of really upper classes with incredible consuming power, that he argues is enabled by the discarding. This is his word. It appeared in Lindsay Dillon's piece also, which I cited. She's part of a group called Discard Studies, by the discarding of other segments of their populations. So a couple of dense quotes from him will follow. He tracks ILO and World Bank records through the 90s and early 2000s, and he says this is the point at which you see the representation change. This is just a exemplary one from 2001. The informal sector now stands out as a potential provider for employment and as a breeding ground for entrepreneurship. He also says, in a longer quote, primitive accumulation of capital in the third world produces, again, the word waste, a vast wasteland inhabited by people whose lives as producers have been subverted and destroyed. But for whom the doors of capital remain forever closed. By this he means the promise that unions fight for, to become full wage earners, to have union jobs, to have benefits, to have time off. These kinds of things which organizers mobilized around since the 19th century, really, he says that door is forever closed. It is this wasteland, he says, constituted by the shadowy figures of the rejected, the marginal, the leftovers, remains an outside. And let's not worry for a moment about the detailed Marxist argument going on here. I'll leave out the underpinnings of Indian Marxist historiography, which requires a separate discussion, but emphasizing the ways in which the informal sector comes to be a subject in the drama of development, rather than an anomalous object to be explained away in terms of its lack of fit. Sanyal is reminding us an important aspect of the constitution of this object of governance is its representation in terms of statistical information, because the statements made about the object derive their authority from this. This is common to us in SDS. This is what we study, the kind of ways in which we can build an object of study through statistical, rhetorical, and political, as well as fact-based observation. Sanyal here is applying the classic methods that we know of close reading and critical historiography and SDS to his object of study, development economics in the 20th century. The informal economy in his account is made by a collection of statistical and anthropological studies of the poor. The poor as a category is all over, of course, development economics. The poor around the world reappear in the last decade of the 20th century in paeans to their salvational potential. Not us saving them, but them saving us. We can see a range of practices and theories then, from Hernando de Soto to C.K. Prahalad, as symptoms of that shift. Academic recognitions of the poor as subjects of study help in turn to shift policymakers as well as grassroots initiatives to help the poor. Various forms of legal and technological openness too, I suggest, must be read within this new historical context in which writing about the post-colonial world has shifted from being an economic embarrassment and state failure to the celebration of inspiring resilience. The bottom billion and their disorderly, chaotic, precarious, resilient creativity are today being constructed as the salvific subject of our global economy. It is the generative capacity of these formerly embarrassing unwashed masses, as well as the criminal activities of the unwired low bandwidth pirates I've argued elsewhere, that point the way to our joint future. In a refusal of both Marxist and capitalist narratives of transition, Sanyal writes informal production into neither optimistic futurity nor nostalgic past. The wasteland of precarious people, he argues, are our contemporaries. They are not remnants of an impoverished past, nor a reserve army of our future upwardly mobile tech workers. The poor, the landless, and the underemployed precariat are the conditions of possibility of India's leapfrogging 21st century takeoff. To move towards a conclusion then with the question articulated by the organizers of the conference, are there unanticipated opportunities or risks created through the implementation of models for open access to knowledge? I want to suggest that there's both, of course, rewards and risks. But I'd like to end by marking a potential risk, although very cautiously and tangentially through a historical analogy. Recalling his hunting activities in late 19th century India, Brigadier General Burton recalled his tireless and trustworthy local guides, such as the, quote, wild gond shikari, described here. Hunting helped construct both ecological and social norms in many colonial contexts. Many missionaries to Africa had financed their expeditions with ivory and offered African populations supplies of meat as incentives for labor. In the second half of the 19th century, hunting in colonial Africa had become ritualized and consecrated as the hunt, capital T, capital H. In India, while the British use of tribals as trackers recalled the similar use of bushmen in Africa, there was an elite dimension to the social significance of shikar, or hunting. British hunters were often hosted by the rulers of princely states, where hunting was a traditional royal pastime, and there were few game regulations that applied to such hunting parties. Here, feudal and colonial rituals reinforced each other, and together had consequences for both the survival of wildlife and for peasant and tribal access to game and protein. Environmental historian John Mackenzie cites Jason Machiwanka, an African in early 20th century Rhodesia. Europeans, he said, took all guns from Africans, refused to let them shoot, but Europeans shoot game. Africans, he said, have to eat only relish with vegetables, referring to the decline of protein in their diet. If an African shoots an animal with a gun, the African is arrested. In periods of famine, Africans no longer had recourse to game meat as a source of protein. While white hunters were contemptuous of the hunting abilities and hence the manliness of most Africans, they valued bushmen as guides and trackers and depended on their expertise. Several colonial campaigners compared suppressing Africans with shooting animals. For example, E.A.H. Anderson, in his 1900 book on the Shona Uprising, compared shooting the Shona to, quote, chasing the fox, rabbiting from bolt holes, shooting snipe, and scaring rooks, end quote. Forrester and historian E.P. Stebbing, like many other colonial officials in India, wrote a book of hunting memoirs in which he declared the first golden rule for the sportsman is to bear in mind that he should keep villagers on his side. Indigenous groups are represented, of course, as having accurate knowledge of nature due to the wild or natural state in which they live. While representations of royal shikar always portrayed native princes as exotic, powerful dominators of forests and game, representations of tribal shikaris were rendered in terms that explicitly equated tribal with animal existence. Natives themselves were repeatedly constructed as part of nature. Nor was this only a rhetorical parallel. These constructions were enabled by material conditions and had practical consequences. They helped colonial officials to contain the threat of the savage, hostile native by representing the native, like nature, as useful if well managed and dangerous or useless if uncontrolled. A current moment in which we might pause today to re-examine the sinks, the dirt, the native, and the poor outside the great divides that we get from this history comes with familiar risks and rewards. By managing, or as Jennifer Gabrice puts it, tidying up the mess we've created in our sinks, the more we focus on waste as dysfunction in opposition to production as clean function, in this separation, we risk losing the chance to question the productive side of the system. The dirt of systems, Jennifer Gabrice warns us, is within the systems, not an externality that can be cleaned up, or whose sudden new promise for value creation suggests that we should keep creating the same kinds of systems, because after all, don't worry, we can make the waste productive. Jennifer Gabrice says, quote, "Our present sinks spill into the sinks of the future." And she ends by saying, quote, "It may even be that the muddying of these boundaries proves to be more fruitful than maintaining them," end quote. I suggest that it is past time to muddy the boundaries between backward and advanced economies, urban and indigenous peoples, workers and capitalists, colonial and post-colonial. The open sharing models that rest on these clean historical abstractions risk reproducing them, just as the great white hunters had to reproduce the abjection of their native guides in order to profit from them. Open knowledge systems run the risk of selling off new forms of data for a dose of rum and a few rupees. Thank you. I'll stop there. Should we take questions now?
10 minutes or so. Are there any questions?
Please wait for the microphone for the stream.
Microphone is kind of.
Hi, my name is Jinfeng Xia. I'm from East Stroudsburg University of Pennsylvania. You mentioned that the information flow more from poor to rich countries than from rich country to poor countries. Today's topic is, the theme is open access. I think with the open access effort, it's more like, I don't want to say it's more like, but it's at least, as equal, the information flow from poor to rich as from rich to poor. Scholars and the people from poor countries benefit a lot from the open access movement. So can you expand this a little?
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you for your question. I want to go back to Chandar and Sundar, who said, indeed, we should celebrate the flow of information, as you say, from poor to rich, right? I do think that there's much to celebrate there. And in the reversal of an old system of diffusion in which, in a kind of stagist model of development, it was assumed that information would always flow from developed to underdeveloped. I think the inversion of that binary is something to celebrate, but we know that inversions are always only temporary reactions to a possibly unequal situation. The first point that Chandar and Sundar wanted us to pay attention to in their 2004 piece, I think, and those here who've been studying this and talking to Madhavi and Anupam could add here, is that if information flows free, there's a problem. The reason this resonated with me is I had worked on the 19th century, on the transfer of natural resources, for example, plant products moving from Latin America through Kew Gardens to southern India. How did that happen? There were two colonies involved. There was a Spanish colonial presence, obviously, in South America. There was a British colonial presence in India. There were travelers financed by every colony searching for the sort of promise of what would later be called economic botany. So resources that were key to the economic success of empire. Right? So one of the early reasons why I chose to focus on environmental history at a time when I went to grad school where the hot topic in colonial history was politics, right? How did they politically gain power? But to me, what was going on, often unremarked, was the control of a little plant that moved from the South American Andes to India, and actually the Dutch were more successful than the British moved to Indonesia. Could change the outcome of disease, health, and empire. So malaria was cured by a drug known to the native Indians of the Andes. It was known because a Jesuit priest and a Spanish Spanish woman with the royal background was cured, and it comes into being. So again, you have resources moving from poor to rich, but who benefits? So thank you for that question. I think it's central to what I perceive the Davis scholars as asking us to focus on.
I have a question about a group of kind of knowledge producers that you mentioned in passing. So, you know, in recent years, you know, India is often represented as a success story, together with Brazil, Ireland, Israel. So it's one of the new so-called tigers in the software industry, right?
Yeah.
So, and the model that goes with that, it's interesting because, so you have Indian software engineers do, you know, offshoring work, you know, of software, or, you know, offshoring work. So that's something that does not require the extraction of resources from, material resources from India. It doesn't even require the extraction of indigenous knowledge in its, you know, or indigenous innovation. It's really, you know, I'm not saying that I believe this, but, you know, it can be represented as, you know, they've got good brains, they've got good, you know, education in, you know, in math and algorithmic thinking, and they're cheap and they're great, and through the internet we can move these goods without. So what do you make of this population, which is seen as, it has become really the exemplar of a certain kind of success story, right? About high tech. So, but it's not the, you know, the masses who manage to do interesting bricolages with waste that you are talking about, right?
Yeah.
So.
Thank you for that question. It's actually central to the book I'm working on, which I didn't talk about, which is on the, it's called The Pirate Function. And it's precisely asking what is the political economy of the pirate. And I was part of what I'm calling several waves of pirate studies. We've had at least 2 waves, and we've celebrated the pirate. Yes, ostensibly, you know, you're creating something out of nothing. You're creating profits out of no exploitation. This seems to violate every rule of political economy that we know, right? So too many things to say because it's a whole other project, so I'll just kind of list them. One, the service labor that I referred to in passing, we want to look at the terms of labor. If the kind of labor that's being extracted, while not literally dirty in terms of toxic or extractive in terms of, like, say, mining, what are we extracting? I think we're setting into place a new system of labor in which the so-called creative workers will never get the deal that 19th century union workers thought they would get. You know, a minimum wage, or let's say a living wage, healthcare, benefits, retirement, pension, that is off the table. So part of defining the creative industries is sort of redefining what it means to work, right? A. Secondly, when we talk about whether it's virtual information or virtual work, I think what's often neglected is the effect on bodies. If you actually talk to outsourcing workers, if you talk to people who've been part of this so-called sort of free explosion of well-educated labor, both in Silicon Valley, in California, and in the Silicon Valley of India and Bangalore. And there's somebody in the audience, Nupur, who is studying the California aspect. I've been studying the Bangalore one. People will say to you how exhausting it is on their bodies, staying up all night. It completely shifts the circadian clock. It leads long-term to you know, physical effects that can be compared to the work that we have talked a lot about in toxic dumps. So the material physical effects, none of this labor is actually really virtual. There are material aspects to all of it. And most importantly, a new kind of creative class, which is being used to undermine older gains of a kind of working class. So I think if you actually look at US nationalism, the way a new immigrant creative class is being posed against a kind of indigenous working class comes out of that myth of the binary of, you know, a class which needs benefits and needs pension, whereas look, this class that will do so much work for nothing. Pranish.
Thank you very much for that most excellent talk. A lot, a whole lot to ponder through in that. One thing that struck me was the need for contextuality in narratives that are increasingly global. And in one area that I have worked on, I've noticed this quite prominently, and that is while looking a very practical example of intellectual property policy, something like parallel importation. So on the one hand, parallel importation, for those of you who aren't lawyers and work with IP laws, is essentially when a book, for instance, is sold in the UK and people in India are legally allowed to import it without taking additional permissions from the publisher. Now, that is something that developing countries have been fighting for, and many people in developed countries have also been fighting for. A few years ago, the US Supreme Court actually ruled parallel importation of books from Thailand into the US legal. Now, I was devastated by that, even though I'd been fighting for that in India, because it is precisely the kind of distortion of the global economic, global economic market, where differently priced books are being made available, thankfully, after long, as the economic power, so to speak, of India increases. Now, those books are again being moved to the US. Now, I think my lesson from looking at this situation and fighting for the allowing of parallel importation in India and failing was that the same policy advice can't be applied throughout the globe, and what does lead to this kind of resource flow and knowledge flow really depends on the imbalance, existing imbalance
Yes.
in power
Yes.
and economics. And so I just wanted to kind of add that as something that came to me as a footnote. So thank you.
That's a great comment. Thank you very much. And I'd like to talk with you maybe separately about why you were alarmed at what you call the distortion of the global market. But let me say just a couple of things. Obviously, we agree that flows depend on an imbalance. And things are going to flow only if an imbalance exists, whether for historical reasons or newly created, of course. I think that we forget to add in the other corrective to the imbalances, in addition to fighting on the open legal stage, is the so-called piracy markets are striving to correct an imbalance too. So many times, if you look at the US motion picture industry, which openly talks about it, the reason, for instance, it was in 2007 or 2008, the first time a US film opened first in China before opening in the US. It was Spider-Man 3, I believe. And the reason they gave was that they're going to pirate it anyway, so let's open it before they pirate it, right? So the same with books. The vast market for pirated books has led to two things, just as in movies and music. On the one hand, press is cracking down on piracy, so we have the kind of tragic stories like Aaron Swartz. We have the stories that all of us, I'm sure in this room, have of presses not even giving us our own PDF copies of our own book because they're afraid that it will escape. So we rarely get the final proofs in PDF, or we don't get it in any shareable form. These are kind of issues that they put into place before they give in to, say, activists like yourself who would be fighting from India or Thailand to change the very laws that perpetuate the inequalities. So I would say, I'm not sure why you were distressed, because this is part of the process that we see. There are various stages in which these mechanisms are opened up. No one stage is perfect, but I would say historically you can look at the different forces now, and we're able to almost predict, oh, if you add this force and this force now, we're going to have this opened up. In the 1990s, it wasn't clear. Now it seems that we need all of these, and I kept sort of laundry list: activists, NGOs, state-sponsored organizations, criminals, all of them play a part in opening these up. So I hope I've got your main point. I think there was more there. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your talk. Something that got me wondering, and this is also just thinking about work I do in general, was that when you look at like the macro narratives, and it's easier to trace how policy change or things like that can have an effect on practices in general. But I was wondering if you can say more about say Anil Gupta or someone as a figure who is involved in the mediation and translation of some of these things. And I don't know him at all, but I'm just like trying to figure out that, of course, there are individuals in this system who have their own like motives and incentives to be mediating entities, right? So how does that play out in terms of social justice, intellectual property, like, because we are right to say that we should not be patronizing to the poor, and then we are also careful about saying the poor can be a resource and so on and so forth. So if you have any thoughts on like a responsible mediating position, yeah.
So that's a great and complicated question, and I certainly don't want to stand here and point fingers at anyone. We know that all of these debates are incredibly complex, and those of you who are in IPR in India and on Twitter, I know, you know the kind of vociferous nature of the kind of, we blame each other for taking the right or the wrong position. So again, a sort of standard ethical guideline in history is that we don't do history to point fingers at the right or wrong actors, but we look at the kind of tendencies play them out. Now, that might seem as a cop-out to somebody who's engaged in the day-to-day work of ethical, legal, and political work in IPR. So let me try one more attempt. When I think I was just starting out as a professor, maybe it's just out of grad school, when I walked on the Shodh Yatra. And I did interview Anil Gupta late at night, sitting on the floor. We were all crashing in some village. And I think that he was absolutely genuine in his desires, and he couldn't foresee the kind of political conjunctures that I'm talking about now. He couldn't foresee them, but Kalyan Sanyal would say these things were already trickling through the NGO circles in the mid-1990s, because as early as the 70s, Keith Hart had done the work on informal sector. So it was in the air, if you will, if not in the textbooks at the time. So I'm completely convinced of the good intentions of not just Gupta, but I'm sure Guha and Gadgil, other people who I criticize in that 2001 piece, even Vandana Shiva, and so on. Having said that, I think your question is very pertinent. How do we as actors now, we're implicated in Chandar and Sundar's point. We're romantic sort of proponents of public domain. How are we participating in this? And I think the only answer is what both the Dean and Mackenzie said, a radically interdisciplinary working group. Not only interdisciplinary on one campus, because you have the limit of who's on that campus by historical accident, but to aggressively open up to the voices that aren't there, whether it's Global South voices, whether it's within Global South, what are the hierarchies that allow some to speak and others to be marginalized. All of these things require constant work. We were used to just saying who's the stakeholder from each of these groups and getting one, but the word stakeholder obscures all the complexity within the stakes. So I would say diversity of opinion, not necessarily just diversity of bodies or identity, but diversity of opinion, politics, discipline is the only way to struggle towards a much more messy, and this is where I follow Gabrice. Let's increase the mess, not decrease it, and I think that's the only way to get to ethics.